The end of the year is always really busy for us. We rarely have time to do anything besides make parts and ship orders. But this last weekend I got a little bit of spare time, so I decided to head to the shop and put in some work on our 3rd Gen Prelude. I have a lot of really cool plans for this car, including some new parts for JSP, but none of it can get done until we get this engine mounted. So today's task is to work on the rear T-bracket and the passenger side engine mount to get them all finished up. In our last episode, we showed you that the car originally came with an H22, but unfortunately the engine mount kit that it had the engine sitting pretty crooked. So we had to remake a passenger side engine mount bracket to get the transmission to sit correctly, as well as modify this driver's side bracket. What we ended up doing was pushing the engine back about 3/4 of an inch and correcting the engine angle so the oil pan sat level with the bottom of the car. The rear T-bracket wasn't even really close to fitting. In fact, the rubber mount itself couldn't even be bolted up to the rear cross member without being under a lot of tension. This meant that the engine had to move over to the passenger side just a little bit more to take the stress off of that rubber mount. But first we got to shave this mounting bracket to give it some room. I originally trimmed it a bit just so that we could get the engine mounted in place, but I'm going to have to grind some more off to get the engine to slide over just a bit more so that we can bolt on that rear bracket. Since now we're strictly just a CNC machine shop, most of my big fabrication tools have been sold off over the years. So I'm just going to be using this 4-inch angle grinder here with a flap wheel and a cutoff wheel to do most of the work today. Now that we shave the side of this bracket all the way up to where the weld is, we're going to bolt it back onto the transmission and make sure that we got a little bit more room to slide the engine over. This is with it all bolted back together and the engine slid over a bit more. As you can see, now we've got a pretty comfortable gap between the frame rail bracket and the transmission bracket. There's a pretty good air gap here. You can also see that we've basically shoved the transmission over almost to the point where it's touching the seam weld on the frame, which is about as far as we can go. So I'm going to say this is pretty good. Now, because this engine was sitting so crooked before, the previous owner tried to drill multiple holes in this rear T-bracket to get it to bolt up to the car. But unfortunately, none of the holes that were drilled actually line up correctly once we got the engine sitting right. And not only does none of the holes go through the engine mount, but this engine mount itself can't even bolt up to the cross member because it's not aligned correctly. So the plan is to cut all of this stuff off right here and make a new end of this bracket that is going to align correctly with the engine mount. Now that we got the T-bracket out on the table, you can just see how much work's been put into this thing. Lots of slotting, lots of drilling, and we're going to have to pretty much remove it all to get this to bolt onto the car. I'm going to start with just a 4-inch cutoff wheel and remove all of the stuff that I know is not salvageable. Then I'm going to come back with the flap wheel and just clean up all of the edges so I can start working on a template for the new pieces. With the bracket trimmed up, now I can bolt the rubber mount to the cross member, and I can use some construction paper to create a template that we can cut a steel bracket from. One other issue I noticed is that this T-bracket is pretty close to the cross member and will actually contact it if you misalign the bracket. So we're going to trim the bottom of this thing quite a bit to give it some more clearance. I've found that the easiest way to template a bracket like this is to take your construction paper, wedge it behind your bracket or something similar, and just use your thumb to impress on the hole location on the rubber mount. Now this is just going to create a dirty smudge on this side, but on the back side of the piece of paper it's going to have a nice clear line that you can use to center a hole for when you cut out the piece. After the hole location is set, come back with a Sharpie and just trace the end of the bracket. This is going to be used for when you draw the actual shape of the bracket as a reference. With the piece of paper out of the car, you can flip it over, hold it up to the light, and you can actually trace your old reference line from the backside and then draw your template for your bracket using the hole location that you were able to scribe with your thumb. I used a 2-inch circle and then I just drew some tangent lines off the side of it. After trimming the piece of paper, I go back to the car and just verify the fitment before I cut it out of steel. For this case, I just used some 3/16 steel I had laying around, and I just cut it out with a 4-inch cutoff wheel to a rough shape, and then came to the disc sander just to clean up and round the edges. Using a center punch on our template, I laid it over the steel to mark the hole location. I drilled a small pilot hole, then I came back with a 1/2-inch drill and drilled the final hole size. After we're done drilling, we take the part over to the car and verify for the fitment one last time before removing the T-bracket and welding it together. Both surfaces are cleaned and prepped before welding. As you can see, there's still a bit of a gap here from one of the original holes. I'm going to have to weld that up while I'm welding the bracket together, but that's no problem. After the new tab is welded on, I'm going to come back with a 4-inch flap wheel and just clean up the bottom of this bracket. This is the area that was hitting the cross member before. So I'm adding a bit of clearance and also just reshaping the bottom of this thing so it aesthetically looks a little bit better. While working with this, I also noticed that I was unable to get to the 3rd bolt on the mount that mounts to the cross member. So I'm adding a little bit more clearance to the top of this bracket that's going to allow me to get a 1/4-inch extension and socket down in there so I can tighten this bolt if I need to. Because the 4-inch wheel is too big to get into all the tight areas, I'm going to have to use a rotary file to clear out the corners. Then I'm going to go back with a sanding roll and just deburr all the edges so there's nothing sharp. After bolting the bracket back into the car, I noticed that the engine mount is really close to the bottom of this T-bracket. This tab here is almost touching or is touching the bottom of the bracket. We're going to need to make some clearance there so that the engine can move around without hitting it. From the top side, we can see that things are starting to take shape. The engine mount is bolted to the cross member without any trouble, and the through bolt fits through without any resistance. Now we can move on to the other side of the T-bracket. For this side, we're going to use the same process as before with a paper template. We cut out the paper template, lay it over the steel sheet, cut out the steel sheet, and then that piece will be welded to the bracket. Before I did this though, I finished the profile shape on the first side to give it a much smoother look. Then I came back and clearanced the bottom side where our engine mount was hitting. Now we can weld on the new piece. The tab on this side is not going to butt weld like the first side. It's actually going to overlap the bracket. This is going to give us a little bit more strength. I'll start by bolting it all together with the rubber mount. Then I can go in and tack all of the areas at the start-stop points of my weld. One of the keys to having a good-looking weld on a part like this is to only put your tacks at the corners of your start and stop points. Anytime that you have to weld over a tack, it's going to disrupt the look of the weld at that point. After it's tacked into place, then I can unbolt everything and remove the rubber mount. This way I don't have to worry about it melting while I'm welding. After everything's welded up, we can let it cool and then we can go bolt it back in the car and make sure everything fits right. From the bottom side, you can see we've added plenty of clearance here. This is going to allow the engine to move around freely without hitting the engine mount on the crossmember. Here's the finished bracket all bolted up. Now that this is complete, what we have left for mounting the engine is to finalize the driver's side engine mount and then possibly address the front engine mount. But both of those are going to be on the next episode. I'm really happy with how the engine sits now. We were able to correct the engine's angle so that the bottom of the oil pan sits level. We also pushed the engine back as far as we could up against the back crossmember to correct the drive shaft angle. And now we can finally remove the tie strap that was holding the engine correctly. This is how the engine is going to sit permanently. All we have to do now is finalize this driver's side engine mount. Thanks for watching. Please comment below with any questions or critiques. If there's something that you'd like us to specifically cover regarding this engine swap, please let me know and I'll be sure to cover them in future videos.